It's already broadcasting. I'm supposed to have another channel.
Hello there.
Hi, welcome to round 4 of the UKM IV scheme. Opening government you have RB, opening opposition you have UKM 5, closing government AQC, and closing opposition you have 2. I will be chairing this debate today. My name is Yongchen, and standing with me will be Satyan and Adam. So let's just start the debate. I'm now going to invite Prime Minister to start.
Mr. Chair, in a world of scarce resources, we think it's a form of negligence or immoral for you to abandon children when you choose to opt into a process that's extremely expensive and can only cater to a specific few people in this world. Let's look where this debate actually going to take place. This debate must happen within the third world context, where population would probably be high and probably the upper middle income who can afford this kind of processes are only a minority in comparison to the majority in status quo. In these countries, a huge majority of the children on the streets are probably don't have proper care, or the foster care could not actually cater to a huge number of it. Second of all, in our policy, it will be simple. This will be a moratorium. That means it's a temporary ban until there is an equilibrium when it comes to the number of children who are without families and those who have families. Thirdly, is that parents who are unable to reproduce, we can always forward them to child services, and these people will follow the same stringent regulations that we have for adoption. Because you also have to recognize that people who can already afford IVF are also the same group who can afford adoption, and these people would actually be passed within these regulations. Fourthly, is that we are happy to provide whatever restrictions that we imposed in the past. Let's say, for example, China only offers a one-child policy. We would still continue that. Contraception, abortion, those things would still be continued. But this debate is about whether the state can actually place restriction over your right to reproduce. And our burden is simple. Our burden is to show you that there is a greater utility when we force parents who have the ability to adopt to actually be part of this process. Two things I'm going to talk about. First thing I'm going to talk to you why the right to reproduce isn't absolute and how we have restricted our rights in the past. And second of all, I'm going to compare to you the value of having a biological child versus care for abandoned children within the context we're talking about. First argument, why the right to reproduce isn't absolute. We have to concede that rights are always according to the situation, and the child that you have also to be taken care by the state in the future. Let's say, for example, that child has to be sustained through public school, and those funding come from taxation. And we only have scarce resource that we can only cater to a certain number of people. We also have to acknowledge that there are certain times where the state sees a utilitarian good. That's where the state actually puts a ban on you. For example, somehow the state believes that there's a population crisis. That's why the state imposes a one-child policy. The state recognizes that the child is able to somehow expand their rights towards the end. So, considering that the state cannot sustain these kind of things, what happens here? Let's draw parallels to other situations. Let's say, for example, when there is a war, that's where the states impose certain forms of curfew or public control, curb freedom of expression because of the greater harm to do so. It's the same principle when we extend here. We have to reclassify the idea of population density or overpopulation as a form of emergency that the whole nation has to take as a burden together in order to control, because that actually translates on how they live or what is their social mobility in the future. If the state cannot sustain the whole thing, that means the whole population cannot pay taxes for it. But here comes the second argument. I'm going to show you the value of having a biological child is particularly marginal in comparison to care for abandoned children within this situation. Firstly, we have to understand why do we want to have kids. The reason why we have kids is because we want to have this feeling where we care for another person within a situation. When you have a biological child, you have certain form of marginal benefits. For example, aesthetics, probably even the looks or even the skin color of the person. There is no much additional utility of having a biological child, especially when you have to spend more for it in comparison. Let's contrast that to the characterization of IVF or artificial insemination. There are two parts of this characterization. Firstly, because it's exclusive only to the upper middle class, that means they're spending their money onto another person and the creation of another burden to the state in comparison. And the money only stays within that. Second of all, is that most of the time, this kind of procedures are subsidized. It is counterintuitive to subsidize something that adds another burden within the situation. For example, because the state has to actually subsidize artificial insemination, but at the same time, that is also the same person where the state has to publicly fund them through by giving them welfare or probably providing them proper schooling if they want to go through public education. Now, this principle. Okay, but before that, yes.
So basically, punishing the rich and the people or couples that are unable to do it naturally. Don't you think it's extremely evil of the state target only those people?
No, it's the same way how we impose taxation to an extent, and it's not punishment. In fact, you are punishing people even more because people that you can already take care of are not actually being taken care, but you are trying to be selfish just because you think that a biological extension is actually you have more utility within that situation. But this principle is similar to how when we have taxation. Within taxation, where we actually channel our subsidies into things that reduces the burden of the state, and we think that for the state to continuously subsidize the act of artificial insemination or IVF only adds on another burden. But let's put a contrast on what happens when these children get adopted. Firstly, we have to understand children in foster care are more likely to face a certain form of stigma when they go to school. school because they don't have any parents. That's where they have a form of psychological discomfort. Or when they grow up somehow, when they somehow have to live outside of that situation, that's where they think they couldn't actually compete with other people because they don't have the same financial backing or the same familial structure that already exists that other people have. Let's contrast that to children being adopted by those within the upper middle income household. Is that firstly, they are able to get the best form of education. When you have parents who are able to actually spend money that they have from access, that's where they are able to get social mobility. Children who are part of the foster care and somehow they don't do well within results, not only they don't get scholarships, no one is actually able to support them decide to go to private institutions. But when you have people within the upper middle income, that's where you allow them to actually go to private institutions instead. It's how to continue their education and get jobs in the future. Second of all, is that you have this form of assurance that you need constantly all the time, because after 18, that's where the state decides they no longer have to take care of you. But the conclusion here is simple, is that you reduce the burden that the state has to actually go through. That means if this person becomes a functioning member in society, he does not have to care for social welfare, that means taxation can actually go to parts that are even more important. And that's where the whole state actually benefits from it. We have to recharacterize on how we see what is an emergency. And the very fact that our earth cannot sustain everyone here is an emergency, and we should not allow people to act negligently by ignoring the child on the streets. We provide you that avenue.
Thank you, Prime Minister. Now I think Leader of the Opposition.
Mr. Speaker, the problem coming from your side is that we have an almost overpopulation of too many children, or at least too many orphans in third world countries, and that's why we need to punish people who cannot conceive naturally, or people who can afford this artificial conception. So we need to punish them because the poor are not able to take care of their children because this burden are put above the state to take care of them. And I think this is very unfair towards these people or this group of people who can afford this type of treatment. But even more than that, ladies and gentlemen, because their idea, the assumptions are that status quo causes no adoption whatsoever, as if these middle income people won't even adopt under the status quo. Secondly, that all of their arguments are underpinned under that, as if that, you know, that all of these burdens that have bad orphanage is then because of bad orphanage or bad care of orphans in these facilities, then you need to put these burdens to middle income people who cannot conceive naturally. And that's very unfair for the government to do so. I think that's how I'm going to take 2 points for today. Firstly, how rights to procreate is beyond the state. And secondly, this is a form of targeting couples who can utilize IVF and sperm bank. But before that, a few more rebuttals. I think that the idea that the value of biological versus adopted children are somewhat unfair, because we think that both have values in their own way, but we think that even people who want the biological children or wants children of their own lineage, there's no problem in it, right? There's certain values towards themselves that they think it's some sort of self-preservation in terms of their genes to carry on these genes to the children. But even more than that, they said that these orphans can't compete because they have no financial or support backing them up. But we think that governments also provide scholarships or at least study loans for these people, or even many people, especially when the bar is lower for people who have lesser financial backing in terms of their family. Sit down. And we think that there's no such problems existing there's not much problem, especially when you justify punishing certain groups of people that has no relation towards this problem anyway. But let's recharacterize people who needs artificial or even natural form of conception. I think that naturally people can conceive in terms of natural way, biologically, but there are people who need artificial conception. For example, people who have low sperm count, low motility rate of the sperm, or even the women who have the egg count the egg is very, or uterus is not suitable for conception. These kind of things, and we also have people who are infertile. So there are different between these three groups of people. And we think even under the people who can afford who needs to do artificial selection, there are groups of people as they have been characterized. People who can afford this and people who cannot afford this. So they put all this burden to this very small group of people. I think that is very unfair for them to do this for this group of people. So before that, yes, Rafiq.
Some people
feel that they're born in the wrong other things to spend money. Should
let Loom deal with that because I don't really see what the relation between it, right? But let's go on to the rights to procreate is beyond the state. First, we think that just because they can't conceive naturally for whatever reasons doesn't justify the state taking over these rights towards these people. Because we think that their problem that they have stated is because of poverty and too much children or too much orphans, and then you justify it by just banning IVF to certain groups of people, right? And secondly, we think that humans are genetically wired to pass on their genes to pass on their genes. This is inherent and natural instincts. That's why states give these rights to these people, and then why would then you restrict this right? And I think they don't even principally believe in their own motion or their own policy because they say this is only a temporary burden. So they agree to us, principally that why rights to procreate is somewhat beyond the state in the absolute sense, right? So government cannot take away this sliver of hope of this group of people to have children in their own blood or in their own biological sense. Sit down. So let's move on to my second point. This is a form of targeting towards couples who can utilize IVF as a form of sliver of hope for themselves, right? So I think that this segregate people on biological capacity because this is very dangerous in the long run because you segregate people who can conceive naturally and people who can only conceive artificially, and then you push the burden of adoption towards this group of people, towards these people who cannot conceive naturally. I think that this is very harmful. Somehow it is a form of punishment and it's very predatory and evil because it punishes people who cannot conceive. Because we think that whether you are biologically fertile, infertile, or you can only conceive artificially is somewhat very luck based. It's not, you don't choose that. And because of that, you don't punish people who are biologically born this way. We think that is very unfair. Sit down. So that's why we think that it's unfair for government to do so. But on the second level, right, we think that this paints the whole idea that as if social burdens for adoption is only for these couples, and it becomes somewhat an obligation for middle income or rich people who can only use artificial or IVF reproduction to have adoption. And this is very harmful because it makes that normal couples or couples who can conceive naturally, but maybe wants to have the idea to adopt because for whatever reason they want to adopt, maybe to have people sit down, don't have the incentives to adopt because this idea that only rich people or people who cannot conceive naturally is have the obligation to do so. How is this different from status quo? Because we think that they didn't picture that there's a because we think that sit down. Because naturally infertiles are not allowed to not push the burden because there's no law that's saying only infertiles can have this kind of things. And it's very dangerous to do so. But even more than that, how? Because we think that's the root of the problem is this. We have two types of people: people who conceive normally, people who can only conceive artificially, and then in terms of normal conception, you have people take care of their children who don't have the capability or the capacity to take care of the children. But just because they have the biological capacity, then they have the rights to procreate. That's the problem, one thing. Secondly, because these problems are what the problem that they have stated. These problems are problems of people who can biologically conceive but cannot take care of the children to be taken. This is very problematic. But then we have second type of people who are capable, financially capable, have capacity, but can only have artificial reproduction or insemination. We can secondly, this is a form of targeting towards couples who can only utilize IVF. Thank you.
Thank you for your proposition. Now I invite you.
Mr. Speaker, when there are hundreds and thousands of children in places like South Africa or in India who are left to be locked up like sardines in overpopulated foster homes, who hardly get meals or get very scarce meals, who don't have access to books to read or toys to play with, or they're left to fend for themselves on the streets, whether to beg or steal or eventually starve themselves to death, and especially when there are people out there who have the financial capability as well as the moral intention to want to care for another human being, we think it is not just morally reprehensible, but we think it should be legally reprehensible that you do not necessarily care for that human being. The fundamental problem from the opening opposition and the leader of opposition speech is that although they sort of conceded that the problem exists, they offered you no alternatives as to how this problem goes away by simply allowing people to have more treatments for IVF. Given that Terence characterized the problem as having overpopulated foster homes, large rates of children who are abandoned or orphaned, analysis simply say that necessarily our policy might have some bad side effects, and all those side effects were merely peripheral to the center and core issue that was necessarily caring for children who can't care for themselves or that state can't care for. In my speech, says that if we, on our side of the house, basically we give no incentive for rich or middle-class individuals to adopt more children because, poorer people to adopt more children because it's something that the rich do. We don't think so, ladies and gentlemen. We think when it comes to social behaviors and opinions, we think the rich and the elite class usually set cultures that other stratas of society follow through. That's why, for example, if you look at the names that people give children, it is usually circulated that when the rich give their children a certain breed of names, that name gets circulated to the poor. It's something, it's very cultural. So when we think when the rich and the middle income start to adopt more children, they essentially take a higher moral high ground. And they have a trend that sets onto other people. So now, for example, if you look at Brad Pitt and Angelina Jolie adopting like African children from Ethiopia, it becomes a cool thing. We think in these countries as well, the more and more children or the more children you want to adopt makes you a more altruistic and a morally supreme person in society. We don't think that argument stands. Firstly, let's revisit this part about rights. We don't think although he did, the leader of opposition did argue about rights, we think that he argued it in a vacuum because he never listened. He probably did listen, but he didn't engage with the characterization that Terence gave you. That your rights, essentially as any individual, any rights you have, be it the freedom of speech, the freedom of movement, or even the freedom to reproduce, are contingent on not just how much the state can accommodate to these rights, but also how society can accommodate to these rights. First, let me tell you that if you're talking about the right to have a child, this differs by countries already. So, and yeah, it might be a bit unfair, but that's how reality is, ladies and gentlemen. There are countries who place restrictions on children. There are countries who make you want to have more children. So, for example, if you lived in Quebec in the 80s to the 90s, where they raised prices on abortion and paid mothers to have more children in order to like spike up their population, that might be unfair to somebody living in India, for example, who isn't paid to have a child. So, all these rights and the liberties that you get and the facilitation of those rights that you get from the state depends on the state and the social strata that you're in. In war times, we suspend rights to speech, we suspend rights to movement, and the same thing happens when we have a crisis of overpopulated foster homes and high rates of abandoned children. We don't think your rights to necessarily reproduce are absolute. But secondly, he also ignored a lot of what Terence said when he analyzed to you the benefits or the marginal benefit of having a biological child versus having a child in and of itself. So if someone, for example, is born with racial dysmorphia or is born in the wrong body and the wrong gender, where to change that problem is a marginal aesthetic benefit to the individual identity of a person, would the state want to subsidize that? Because the argument falls when you apply the logic on the government's case. Because having a biological child is only a minor benefit because the child that you have is somewhat identical to you. We don't think that benefit can supersede the utilitarian benefit of a state for getting you to care for a child that cannot care for themselves. In this instance, the state has to make a priority. It's either we get people to take up more orphan children, or we let them make more people that say as to care for, leave all these children behind just for that small aesthetic value of having a biological child. And we don't think that they care less for the orphan child. We think even if they do bring up that analysis, we think that's rather mature. Parents who want to have children right now simply want to do so because they want to leave something behind. They want a legacy. They have that sense of communitarianism. They need people in the household, for example. We don't think that they care for any less for these people in the first place. Moving on. How do we remove the stigma from orphan children? Before that, I'll take any POIs.
Then if you say that the problem is overpopulation of too many orphans, why not remove the rights to procreate from poor people who cannot have the capacity to take care of these children?
Yeah, we're fine that. We said that this is in tandem with other forms of population control, whether we want to place restrictions on children, whether we want to give more contraceptions out to people, or make abortion free for anyone. We told you that was part of our policy anyway. Now, moving on to my substantive. How do we remove the stigma from orphan children? So let's understand the problem behind adoption, why a lot of people don't want to do that. The problem is usually because these children come from bad backgrounds. They come from poor communities, single parent homes, violent homes, for example, parents who, before couldn't care for these children. Now, why don't people take up adoption? First, because the rich and the elite class don't do it. Usually people who adopt are people who are or middle class in mind. We're going to apply for all these stuff, but necessarily that money goes towards creating another human being. So why does our model remove that stigma? When you essentially remove the alternatives for having biological children, what you essentially do is you incorporate you get more people to do it. And once more people do it, especially when it's the rich and middle income, especially since they are the ones who can give these children better lives and more likely to send these children to college, get these children health insurance, less likely for them to be committed in crime, for example. And because the rich are now starting to do it, we think more and more people are going to start seeing the benefits of this model. Currently, right now, too many orphan and abandoned children are going towards families who cannot already care for them. But the nature of the people who want these treatments in the first place can afford to take care of orphan children. We think more and more people start adopting children and can care for them well. We think that removes the stigma. More children get adopted and cared for. Thank you.
Thank you, Prime Minister. We close out the opening houses. Now I'd like to invite the Minister of Opposition.
Can I get the other chair? Sorry.
Sure.
Mr. Speaker, if you look closely to what opening government has to offer us, it's a solution that necessarily doesn't really have an impact per se, because they're targeting two people or a group of people that's so minute within society. Number one, that they are a subset of the community, that they're only rich and have the sufficient funds to cater to society. And within this subset of the community, there exists another subset, right? People who are rich and are unable to naturally give birth and to conceive in a natural manner. So we're going to say only a very small minority of this community is responsible for every single people or every single children that are unadopted and are orphans, Mr. Speaker. We tell you it's extremely problematic, because if you really notice their problem in today's debate, it's not that there is lack of adoption, Mr. Speaker. It's just there's too much orphans per se. So we tell you there are other alternatives, and we cannot limit the justice that exists in status. So, Mr. Speaker, you can do a lot of things. For example, your reproductive methods, Mr. Speaker. need to adopt through means of giving them tax breaks and also financial incentives. Anything that is better than limiting the choices of these individuals. We say an alternative does exist and we can take that into account. No, sit down. But more than that, Mr. Speaker, they go on to tell you that, there's a comparison between biological and adoption and whatnot. See, the thing is, we don't necessarily think that is an issue per se in this debate because there's no problem. What we're trying to do is allow the choices of adopting or naturally, artificially conceiving to be given to the parents and they decide what is best for them. If they think it's too expensive, Mr. Speaker, then don't do it, right? If they want to adopt out of altruistic reasons, then we allow them to adopt as well. Because only the parents know what is best for them and what is the needs required. If they want someone to look after them when they are old, Mr. Speaker, regardless of whether or not they are biologically connected, this doesn't require government's intervention to force them into a decision that they don't even know whether it's the best decision for them in the end of the day. We tell you extremely problematic. Sit down. Then they go on to tell that the rich will who are catering and ensuring a good lifestyle and welfare for the families at the end of the day. But then, Mr. Speaker, you cannot only force the responsibility towards the rich, right? It's not the job of these people. You need to understand it's a collective benefit, a collective responsibility at the end of the day. But because right now you're only telling the society and painting a picture that these rich individuals are the ones who must take care of these individuals. So anyone else can let go and release themselves of absolve themselves of all responsibilities to cater towards these individuals. This is a message that you're more likely to portray at the end of the day. Because I promise Mustafa, go.
African American of being biologically black, would you then prevent all African Americans from reproducing because you don't want their children to be discriminated?
No, I'm not preventing them. I don't understand what's the issue, right? Okay, now I'm going to tell you, Mr. Speaker, why at the end of the day, with this ban, you're making it extremely difficult for parents to have kids, whether through adoption or through artificial insemination, because you already banned that aspect. So what's left right now is the method of adoption. But if you look in status quo, it's extremely difficult for parents to go through the screening process and to years of financial capacity. And parents or couples who can naturally get or adoptive parents to go through those things. And if they were to fail, Mr. Speaker, you are limiting or closing all options for them to have any possibility of a kid at the end of the day. Everything is extremely problematic because right now, not even are you restricting their limits and their choices, Mr. Speaker, you're also restricting the ability and the privilege to have a children in the first place. And we think you very extremely unfair, extremely cruel for state to do so. Sit down. But more than that, there are red tapes and also many procedures that they need to go through, and it takes a lot of time. And then you have issues like racial lines whereby they allow parents to adopt, or not adopt because of their race and whatnot. This creates prejudice and we tell you extremely problematic. Two issues, Mr. Speaker, or substantive, I'll bring to you today. One, I'm going to talk about the regress, how you are regressing the scientific advancement of reproductive methods, and second, how you create a paradigm shift of how society views adopted children. Let's go to the paradigm shift one because I like to talk about that. Mr. Speaker, we tell you, now you're portraying that these children, or the reason why they are adopted is because they are the final option and they were adopted because the parents were forced by the government to do so. Because, Mr. Speaker, you have this policy, so the only alternative is for parents now to adopt. So you create a perception or a perception that these people are adopted because the government did it and forced the parents to do so. We think, Mr. Speaker, it further enhanced the tagline that these children are unwanted and they were taken in as a final choice or because of this policy, regardless of whether the parents' intentions were good or because of love, Mr. Speaker. We think this thought should react will in the first place because this will further discriminated, Mr. Speaker. Everything extremely problematic because now you're forcing these children to live in a very hostile environment and atmosphere, and they tend to distance, or they're more likely to distance themselves from their parents, Mr. Speaker, because they don't think they're doing it out of love, but doing it out of mercy, and also some other reason that they're having they just pity them, Mr. Speaker. We tell you also further, Mr. Speaker, you're reducing the amount of adoption based on altruistic reasons, Mr. Speaker, because you remove that tagline, or you remove the perception that your people are doing it out of goodwill, and you make it such a normal thing that you reduce the intake of these adoptive children at the end of the day. Let's move on to the idea of regressing scientific advancement. I tell you, it's very principled because very important is to ensure that the continuity of our own race. As the increase of population happens, Mr. Speaker, we are also biologically hardwired in the aspect of our brains to actually continue our population. So any scientific progress needs to be continued and can only continue if the funding and the demand exists. By banning it from time to time and creating uncertainty of when this artificial insemination is required, Mr. Speaker, you create a jarring gap between when the next funding will come and when the next demand will come. We tell you, Mr. Speaker, you stall all progress and you create a gap of knowledge from the moment you ban to the next one, Mr. Speaker. We tell you this jarring gap of knowledge will necessarily slow down the entire progression of this IVF. We feel it's extremely important because with progress, Mr. Speaker, with funding and with demand, you create a more efficient, cheaper method of IVF, creating higher success rate, therefore reducing the price at the end of the day. And this is where you can remove all the subsidies and allow it to be relied on. But more than that, you also can increase the storage period of sperms and ovums that is valuable to people because they now have the assurance that it can be used in the future, which can, at the end of the day, ensure the continuity of our humankind. Because of all those reasons, we're extremely proud to oppose.
Thank you, the leader proposition. Now I think my program is out here.
The burden on side opposition in today's debate isn't to tell us why these people are discriminated, because they are at the same time not defending having IVF as a free option to everybody. Because if the right to procreation, the right to have a child is such a the state cannot discriminate against you, then you must defend giving everyone free IVF treatment and free access to sperm banks, because you remain to discriminate these individuals on the basis of a biological incapacity. And that's where most of my speech will fall in. We'll tell you, our opening told you why we have a problem, and these are individuals who are capable of doing it, and therefore they should do it. What we'll tell you is why the state was involved in the creation of this problem, and why these individuals have a responsibility as citizens of society who don't have this biological privilege of being able to have a child. But more importantly, we need to understand what the state does for individuals who lose natural rights, because the assumption is that the right to procreate is one that is natural. But when the lottery of birth has disabled you from gaining this natural right, you then are not necessarily entitled to the same right. And that's where my POI comes in very relevant. We don't prevent African Americans from having children simply because there's a likelihood of discrimination. That discrimination is because of skin color, which is a biological disadvantage. What we do is we attempt to remedy this issue by giving you rights and imposing affirmative action. In other words, the duty of the state in this particular case, where you don't have the biological ability to reproduce, is to assist you in having a child. Not biologically, but simply having a child. That's where the state's burden stops. And therefore the state preventing you from having a biological child is not any sort of act of discrimination, because the state's fulfillment of liability is only insofar as allowing you to access a child. Business already exists that assists you in having a child. But we also don't think that it is principally inconsistent to argue that the process of vetting in terms of adoption are unfair or fair. If they want us to argue marriage or license to have birth, we're happy to do this another day, but we're also happy to bite the bullet and say, yes, force people to get licenses in order to have children, because the life of an individual is at stake. And when these individuals fail, it is the state then that takes up this burden. There is no point for me to relieve the burden to you, just for you to it becomes a redundant system. Those are the bullets, or those are the principles we're going to defend in this debate. A little bit of rebuttals, and then off to my case. So note a couple of things and that don't necessarily fit into my rebuttal. So first, he said that we're necessarily relegating a burden to such specific group of people. A handful of my speech will be about why it's okay to relegate it towards this individual. Second, his biggest problem was the system of adoption is biased. Fix the system. If there's racism, go deal with it. Resolve it. But the bigger issue is I've already argued to you, we're perfectly fine with making people get licenses in order to have children, because the state should not have to take on your failures, because you're also part of a system that needs to be coherent. But we're not defending this because that's not the debate today. The other thing was we're embracing the stigma of unwantedness. That very argument is the same argument against any sort of affirmative action for any groups that are discriminated in society. Because the initial knee-jerk reaction in society will always be a rejection of affirmative action for individuals. In other words, this stigma exists today. You're not doing anything to resolve it because you're not encouraging people to adopt. But on the other hand, when the state says these are individuals who deserve to be adopted, and your right to have a biological child does not supersede the right of this child to have a happy life, that is when the state is sending a positive message of the value of these individuals in society and their right for you to spend money on them. Sit down. The other thing we talked about was biological development. We think that biological development occurs anyway, and the state can continue investing on it. The development of IVF was never contingent on the rate of consumption, because they argue that consumption is insignificant. If it was that insignificant, nobody would be spending on it. But the state has an interest to spend on it, assuming that the state needs to do so. But we're not arguing that to you. But if that is a big problem, the state will continue to invest on it because the state has the resources to do so. But let's move on to what we have to talk about in this video. Before that, any POIs?
Alright, the state's responsibility, according to you, is to allow the couples to have children. By banning IVF, you reduce the chance of achieving that goal. Now you fail to ensure the initial responsibility of the government for the first place. What is your response?
No. Having a child, as long as it doesn't intentionally right that child. That's where I currently argue and said we're perfectly fine for preventing everybody from having a child if they are not capable of having a child in terms of being able to fund the child. I'm being principally consistent by defending that stance. We're perfectly fine with it. They exist together or coherently. So let's first understand how these orphans came about in the first place. These orphans came about through multiple ways, but the most amount of these orphans come from individuals who don't want their children because, well, it was premarital sex or whatever it is, or individuals who are unable to afford the maintenance of these children. The state was complicit in the creation of both problems. First, in the failure of the state to educate individuals, successfully educate individuals in taking protective measures, but more importantly, the failure of the state to provide sufficient infrastructure mechanisms to ensure social mobility exists to remove the poor from their inability to essentially mobilize. Considering the state has yet to impose licenses on individuals who have children, we're perfectly fine with imposing those licenses. So therefore, the burden is squarely on the state to protect these individuals. And because it is also on the state, it is by default a responsibility of society. Why? Because the responsibility is the state that essentially ensures social harmony, which is something that was briefly touched on when they talked about how these children eventually could become criminals. That's where the society becomes collectively responsible for protecting these children. So what are we okay with doing? Two things. First is what this debate is about proposing, which is essentially ensuring that individuals who are capable, who have the intention to have children, and who the state owes a right to assist in having children, get a greater priority, for instance. But more importantly, this doesn't become mutually exclusive from pushing the burden on the rest of society by encouraging adoption altogether or providing tax breaks for individuals who adopt children. They are not mutually exclusive. So we're not throwing the burden on a specific set of individuals. We're allowing these individuals to take their right of having a child, at the same time facilitating social harmony by ensuring some children are taken care of without infringing on the third party harm, which is this child and these parents. So we actually have a situation of a willing party, which is the parent who wants to have a child, and a child who will eventually be benefited. Unless they're willing to defend free IVF for everybody, they can't stand and say you are discriminating against these individuals because you don't give them the right to have children biologically. To sum up our case, what we stand for is ultimately that the state's role is to equalize as much as possible the circumstances on the ground insofar as its resources are able to do so. When more children stay in orphanages, the state subsidizes IVF and you have more children that come into the system. That is an exponential increment in population. I have to spend on your child that you get out of IVF, but at the same time I have to spend on the child that you've refused to take out of adoption when you could have done so. I have to spend on the both of you. And that also has a greater impact on the collective society as far as the expenditure of taxpayers' money is. We think both comes at the benefit of the optimization of taxpayers' funds, but more importantly, the provision of these children for a place to go. The state was complicit in this problem, and so was society, and therefore we must take responsibility for it. They are a convenient option, but we're more than happy to try and encourage everyone else to do so. We're not discriminating against them because we don't force black people not to have children because they're discriminated. Here.
Thank you, Member of Government, to speak. Now it's the Vice Member of Office.
Yeah.
Mr. Speaker, closing opposition is going to argue two things. Firstly, I'm going to tell you why government's policy creates two classes of parents and you are inherently discriminating one over the other, more explanation of that. And secondly, why it's not in the best interest of these adopted children who are forced into the adoption pairing with a parent who is unwilling or forced into that particular circumstances. Before that, several rebuttals to cite closing government. Essentially, the only thing you wanted to say is this: state is responsible for adopted children to become orphans. So somehow society should shoulder that burden necessarily. But the question is now, why are you only punishing one particular subset of society in the quest for social imbalance or to repair the social state's failure in a sense? That it is the poor and middle class people who are infertile, who are denied the right to have children or to even adopt a child because simply they do not have the money to raise a child necessarily. They probably will sue for child abuse if they don't maintain the child properly. So they are denied in the quest for the state's failure to correct their wrongdoings. That is not an equitable policy that you can force upon people. Sure, the rich and middle class will take on it, but it shouldn't come at the expense of the poor and middle class people who cannot afford to adopt a child. You are putting them in dire straits necessarily. But before that, sit down. The other thing that OG wanted to talk about is also this. Somehow they want more children to be adopted. Let's say the problem with a policy that is only temporary is that essentially people will have a waiting game. They will just wait for the next phase where the quota is filled so that they are able to now have their own children through IVF already. They essentially no one will want to adopt children because I'll just wait. Maybe in the next 5 years, there will be no more orphans, I can do IVF now already. But this policy also creates a system where when people know that adopted children are adopted by middle class and high income people, you create incentive for kids and for people to dump their children into orphanages so that they have potentially a better pairing with a richer person. You must recognize, why do children become orphans? Not orphan because all of their family members have died. They still have some relatives around. Those relatives normally take care of that particular child when he's being an orphan when the mother or the father dies. But now, the kids now will have an incentive to wash their hands of the child, to put them in an orphanage because they know that there's some point of time when the orphan will get access to a potentially rich person. But so you create more orphans now because your relatives now are willing to dump these orphans into orphanages simply because they are unable to tap into this particular problem, and they shift the burden entirely to a nebulous and ambiguous rich middle upper class who wants to take care of them. We'll say comparatively, you can always tax the rich, Mr. Speaker, to channel it to a better adoption services. Essentially, a state can be a replacement of a parent. If the state can provide education to the child, kids to underprivileged children like universities at UT Mara, for example, essentially, you are able to give these children access to higher education or other opportunities too. If the state is able to be the one to replace the role of a parent, like you said, there's no something more than the utility doesn't change biologically. So I'm assuming that you don't need the emotional support of the parent to raise up the child. Because essentially the state can provide that kind of services. People from single parents will grow up to be functioning adults. We say that you don't need both parents or even a parent to become a functioning member of society. The state can provide that alternative. Yeah, okay. Please sit down. Let's look at the policy material. How you create second-class parents. Essentially, why do people don't have the chance to have pregnancy naturally? They go through things like multiple miscarriages, which is a very physically tiring aspect. They go in and out of hospital necessarily. You have low sperm count or you have a defective ovum. They are often socially ostracized and emotionally prepared to say you are infertile. People laugh at you. You go through this kind of problems in necessity. But now, under a noble objective for the state, healthy parents need not participate in this social function of the state. They go scot-free. Instead, you punish these infertile parents who already gone through these traumatic experiences to take up this particular opportunity. You say that you are denying them essentially the medical technology that can potentially make them able to have a children with it. Instead, you are punishing them. Because recognize on their side, the poor people who are infertile and who cannot now have a child because they simply cannot adopt a child anymore. They're unable to have their lineage continue, unable to have another source of people, a person who can take care of them their old age, unable to educate a person so that these children are able to take care of their livelihood when they are their old necessarily. You're denying the poor and middle class income people. You create a double jeopardy to these unhealthy parents necessarily and poor people necessarily. Their principle of OG that this right to reproduce is not absolute can only be accepted when all people are subjected to the same thing, the same principle. Like China, for example. But when you only deny and expect the rich and upper class middle to take up this objective, and you're denying necessarily, you're not being consistent in the principle that every person necessarily can have their right to reproduce, absolutely imposed on them. The state is sending a wrong message to say that these parents should just give up on not having a child. They're not worthy of having a child necessarily by your own. You should just take into this last resort of taking care of a child necessarily. Before I move on from opening.
So first you say that it's unfair that the rich have to adopt children and the poor abandon. Yet you support increasing taxing on the rich to provide welfare for the poor.
Because if the rich people are able to voluntarily take up the child necessarily, they have better conditions. In either way, if you have better taxation and you channel to the children and adoption services, they have better lives. If rich people voluntarily take up these children, they will have a better life too. There's no necessarily double class citizens. Let's go to the second thing I want to talk about. How the best interest of the child is not sustained under their side. Because when parents are paired up with a child simply because it's the last resort, you don't have an active choice of having that particular child. You're forced into that kind of relationship. You're simply not in a state of mind to take care of that particular child. You don't go through the same similar processes of pregnancy, for example. You view it as a form of punishment by the state. That this is something that you should just take and leave it. That you are denied all the alternative rights. When that kind of stigma, when the denial of having a real child is in the mind of the parent, whenever he looks at that adopted child in his family home, he will never treat the child the same way necessarily. The issue of compatibility is here. Because the parents now are trapped in that mindset of vengeance by the state, of angriness and dissatisfaction. They will never be able to translate that to genuine love of the child. Either the child will be worse off in that situation. For all those reasons, we are extremely proud to oppose.
Okay, thank you for the opposition. To close up on the bench, now I invite Robert here. Here.
Master Speaker, a couple of laws coming from the side closing. First of all, they assume that when we are enforcing, like when we are like restricting the ability of parents to have their own biology through artificial means, we are now like probably assuming them to like just take kids from orphanage anyways. But then that's not our proposal. Probably it's a misconception gotten on from them, because we believe that any parent, any individual that wants a kid and will do a whole level of things to spend as much as that huge amount to go through that process to have a kid should be the individual who is capable into like catering for this kid. And if children is that important for these people, then we see no reason why they won't want to take these children, because it's not only like the biological or connection that is making them like want to have children in the first place, but the law or the fact that there's somebody there that will cater for them or continue their legacy is enough incentive for them to want to adopt babies from the orphanage. And we see this to be something that is beneficial under our paradigm, because we're not only like making these people use their to pass their legacy on these kids who probably need it. But then we're not incentivizing them to make further expenditures or to make artificial expenditures as to going through this process of bringing more bodies into the system. And these are the whole set of cases that's coming from the side government, which they fail to bring proper justification to from their whole bench. But then a couple of rebuttals before I move to our substance as from the member of government. First, the side closing government, they already said, the fact that simply we're talking about this idea of single parent and how they want to have a baby. If you're a single parent, you want a baby, then it's not just for biological connection or genetic reasons only. It's probably because you want someone to care for or somebody to cater for. And this is enough reasons for you to adopt from orphanage, and because you now have somebody to care for or to look after for, and this is enough. It's enough compensation for that single parent you are talking about in the first place. Because we believe that if you are actually forcing them out of option like they claim we are trying to do under our paradigm, then we see these people not to be in any reasonable reasons to adopt these kids anyway. Because these are probably these people, even with the money they have or not, they won't adopt this kid because they don't feel connected to these kids. So we don't see how the life of the kid again is threatened as to the second point that's coming from the closing when they say the life of the kid itself and how it is important. Because we believe that the only parents that are adopting these kids are the ones that are willing to cater for somebody and are the ones that should cater for them. We don't see how this is problematic at all, because we now believe that this kid, rather than spending their whole life in the orphanage that is full of lack of opportunities, we now have even more opportunity in his life as to self-actualize under the development of parental care. And this we see to be a lot beneficial under our paradigm as to the harms they are talking about. In fact, because this harm won't exist in the first place, because a parent that don't want a kid because it's not his own kid won't adopt this kid, and we don't see how that is problematic at all. But then when we're now talking as to whole level of how these kids are made, speaking of these adopted kids, we believe that what they're trying to provide biological connection, if parents are biologically connected, if that's that important under their paradigm, then we see no reason why people will abandon their babies in the first place, because we believe that what is making people abandon their babies is probably because they are financially incapable. But if they believe that this love is enough to even supersede these financial capabilities, then they won't adopt this kid, and these kids won't be burdened on the state. And we believe that this whole process alone is the failure as to the system. And then we now see that the moment there's a failure or insurgence like this, then it's quite fair enough to create some level of state of emergency in these areas, and it's genuine enough to seize the power or the right of individuals as to the betterment of what's happening on the state, because everyone is the part of this situation. And even these key parents that are well financial enough to afford what we call IVF or any other means are even part of this system, and it should be some kind of collective burden that they are claiming from the opening as well. So we don't see how that's unfair on these people, because we believe it's a collective failure and it's a collective burden that someone should cater for. Because what we have currently, when we talk of the welfare that has been going into orphanage, and it's not doing enough, and we need some sort of insurgence in this kind of situation. And we'll be the moment there are issues like this, then we'll be that all these kind of issues supersede the right of the individual. And that is where we have state of emergencies in situations where there are insurgence or crisis that the opening has already. And we see this to supersede it. Before I move on,
Okay, a child can help elevate couples from being poor because your background does not dictate you to fail, Mr. Speaker. But how can that happen if poor parents were not unable to have the child? They close the option of IVF and they cannot pass the prerequisite of this adoption test. How is that?
For a couple, we don't. Because that's enough discrimination, even under the paradigm, except they are willing to defend how they make IVF, which my first speaker has talked about, or make it free for individuals. We don't see how this discrimination that they are talking about in their whole bench is really that heavy, and we should look about it. So then, what are the conclusions that come out of this argument? first of all, like both houses are trying to prove to you on how individuals' rights is nothing, is that not that like comprehensive when we're talking about rights here, because we believe that provide, like Mustafa already told you, like the rights out has already failed the moment you cannot have the child naturally. It's only a privilege that the state has offered you, and the moment we take this privilege away, we don't see how we don't see any tangible harm that is affected, because we believe that if you want a child, if you need someone to cater for, you cater for someone else's kids the way you look after your own kid, and we see this to be something tangible. But then how has the closing outshine other parties in this debate? First of all, we are the only party entity that has been able to justify to you why it is then right, and this trade-off we're making is well justified as to what has come up from the member of government speech, and with this we're proud to propose.
Thank you, Governor. To finish up this debate, now I can invite opposition. Yeah.
For a moment, I thought I was debating against Sydney Union for the amount of burden pushing that came from that side, but never I'm going to do a whip speech. I'll be firstly addressing opening government. Secondly, I'll identify the issues that came out of the closing government, and then I'm going to reinforce the things that came out from closing opposition and why we are the most relevant team, right? Let's move on to opening government right away. Because from the very beginning, it's very clear that they have two burdens, right? Number one, the burden was to solve overpopulation. Secondly, the burden was to remove stigmatization of orphans. Let's see whether they've achieved any of that, right? Let's move on to the first one, idea of overpopulation. Because they say that, overpopulation is not a global crisis, and as a leader, as population of a third world country is supposed to solve that. But can we actually solve it? Let's just analyze, right? Because firstly, the idea is this, that only the middle-rich class are the ones who are going through IVF, and therefore only they are subjected to this. But then again, you have to understand the contextualization that we're talking about here. The people who are going there, therefore, who are going to actually adopt more people from your policy that you force them to, are the middle to rich income. Among those middle-rich income, you're only talking about the people, for example, who are infertile. That's why it's already 10% of 10% of the population, right? How is that very problematic? It means that you won't solve anything at all, right? Because if you're talking about wanting to solve overpopulation, you simply do not have enough people to actually adopt those people from the orphanage themselves to actually solve this idea. But even if you want to talk about how now you use them as a point, sit down first, I'm not even halfway there yet. But even if you want to talk about how you use them as a form to setting up precedents, right? We see that it's very harmful because number one, you don't have enough critical mass to create this form of precedence that we want to talk about, because considering that there is already a limited population, you can never achieve that. But even if, right, you want to talk about how you allow these people to actually create precedence and now the poor people will start adopting it, we don't believe that it's going to be true, because they're talking about a third world country itself where the poor population barely have enough money to actually fend for themselves and their family right now. How are you going to incentivize them to actually go out there and adopt more people? We don't see how it's going to be. We don't see how it's going to work that way, right? On the worst case, it's not whether or not people now go through IVF or adopt. Now it's a case of whether or not people adopt or they don't adopt at all. So these people will still be left in the orphanage. There will be no incentive for the poor people to actually go out there and pick them up because they think it's already a burden. The only reason why these poor people are willing to conceive in the very first place is because they want a trace of the legacy be passed down. The idea of a lineage is the only thing that they can rely on. The idea that they are already poor, they need someone that can actually go on there and continue and make full use of the resources that they have, the scarcity of it, and then to make some best full use of it. Why will these people now be incentivized to go out there and take another children which has no significance to them? Sit down. The second burden of them wanting to prove is the idea of stigmatization in the whole, right? We're going to prove to it in two ways why it has failed. Number one, on the perception of orphans. Nowadays, the idea of you want to make them feel more belonging, you want to say that, they can actually succeed too, will backfire, because now you force people to say that the only reason you are adopted is because you're an orphan at the first place. They're not going to say that these people willingly take you up. They're going to say that, look, these parents only took you up because they're infertile and therefore they accepted you into a family. This creates this idea of victimization to these orphans themselves when they feel that they don't belong there. Truly, they're only there because a policy of the government itself. These are the people who will receive less care. These are the people who are going to be less receptive towards anything that's coming up from the parents themselves, because they feel that it's a form of policy and it's not this altruistic purpose you want to talk about. Sit down, right? The idea is this: when you have this more banker policy, it's going to make a bad perception, right? Especially
when we're talking about the parents that you want to help under your paradigm. Because now it won't be a trend. People won't come out here and say that, oh, you're such a nice person because you're an adult. People will simply say you adopt because you're infertile, and that's why we can actually differentiate you. You allow people to even further stigmatize you based on what biological disadvantage that you have in the very first place. But even if you want to talk about a trend and how it presents a trend, it's also very dangerous because now people will opt into it because they simply think that the rich are doing it and therefore I do it without actually considering the consequences of what's going to happen. We believe that in the long run, these people, when they realize that it's not exactly what they want, they haven't opted into adoption in the very first place, these people now cannot opt out. That means the children are going to be stuck with them forever, right? And we believe that that's going to be harmful because the standard of care that you provide towards the children is going to be severely lessened. They'll view it as a burden more often than a gift, and this will cause you to talk about. Because when we talk about functionality, something that's right, opening government wanted to argue, we believe it's a really tackle under status quo. When the government goes out there and actually gives you special scholarships based on your family background. For example, when you're orphaned, more often than not, you're entitled to more scholarships, right? These are all form of corrective procedures that the government. See why you have this group better. Why exactly has this middle rich income group consented to actually taking care of the fake short doings of the government itself? Because we believe that functionality is right. As long as these people receive enough education, we believe that the functionality point is solved. These people will also come up to be functional members of society. But before that, I'll take opening.
Now, this debate doesn't, whether this debate actually passes through, it doesn't concern poor without children. And this debate is also a subset of many other adoption policies that are not mutually exclusive. The question now is that how is the newly adopted child's position, who now have education, insurance, and is now probably rich, is more at disadvantage in comparison to an orphan and foster care?
No, the minimum that you need to take, that's why for you to have access to tertiary education is already covered under status quo. All the things that you're talking about, for example, private institutions, are merely aesthetic things that you are so against in the very first place, right? These are all things that are already covered. We don't see what's the problem with that. But the debate became essentially about middle and rich class because you yourself recognize that they are the ones who are going to go through the IVF. We are not squirreling away. We're just saying that those are the contextualization of who are the ones going to go through. I'll tackle you later, right, Mustafa? Now let's move on to them exactly. Because the only thing that Mustafa wanted to talk about is two things. Number one, on how, by the way, the whole idea of us accepting free IVF, we're okay with it, right? If you have the resources to do so. But the fact that it's a third world country resource, but principally we're okay with that. As long as we allow people choice. Even under this, when we allow to give free IVF, we are not forcing them to take IVF. We are allowing them the consent to actually whether you want to take IVF or whether or not you want to adopt at the end of the day. Essentially what they're doing is they're forcing them to go through this idea. The idea that the government has already failed and therefore I'm subjecting you to do it. If you consider that it's already a collective effort to remedy a social ill, why shouldn't you put the burden onto the whole society as a whole, but only put it on the shoulders of an already disadvantaged group, right? We believe it's very harmful. But secondly, when Mustafa came out here and compared it to affirmative action, we believe it's very harmful, right? Even affirmative action itself, you present the people, the disadvantaged group, with more opportunities, not force them to take. For example, if you want to talk about blacks in America, they don't force them to take up certain jobs for them to come out from this social poverty they don't want to talk about. They present them with chances, but if they don't want to take it, that's be it, right? So what has side closing opposition provided to you at the end of the day? Two very relevant points. And number one, on how the standard of care that you so want to talk about will be damaged if you force people to actually go into it and not consent into it. But secondly, we create this idea of discrimination of a certain group and the idea of a second-class parent when you say that these people are only there to adopt, not because they want to do altruistically, but because they are forced to comply with it. We don't want that to happen. We are very proud to oppose.
Yeah. Okay,